She did not weep, she did not beg. Eliza Caldwell pulled the gold band from her finger with the steely resolve of a woman who had already made her peace with what was to come. She placed it on the table between them and said, "Keep it, I am done." The ring spun once, catching the candlelight, before coming to rest at Clara Whitmore's trembling fingertips. Jonathan Harrington's scream ripped through the grand hall like a gunshot. The summer of 1815 offered no mercy in Charleston. Heat pressed down on the Harrington plantation, thick, suffocating, unyielding, like a hand clamped over a mouth. Even after sundown, when lanterns were lit and the great hall filled with the melody of fiddles and the clink of crystal, the air refused to cool. Ladies fanned themselves with practiced elegance. Gentlemen tugged at cravats damp against their necks. The house slaves moved between guests with silver trays, their faces composed into masks that revealed nothing, for nothing was ever safe to reveal. Eliza Caldwell stood near the far window, a glass of wine untouched in her hand. She was 24 years old, the sole heir to the Caldwell Atlantic shipping fortune, a legacy that stretched from the wharves of Charleston to the merchant offices of Boston and Philadelphia. Her dark hair was pinned in careful coils. Her green silk gown had been chosen by her mother before she died, and on her left hand, a gold band she had worn for 3 years. 3 years. She had counted them lately, not with fondness. Miss Eliza, her maid, Ruth, appeared at her elbow. Ruth was older, quiet, observant, in the way women without power learn to be, watching everything and saying only what was absolutely necessary. "You ain't eaten a thing since this afternoon." "I'm not hungry." "You sure ain't fooling me with that answer, ma'am." Eliza almost smiled. Almost. "Where is he?" Ruth hesitated. That hesitation, that small, terrible pause, told Eliza everything before a single word was spoken. "He's on the south floor, near the string quartet." "And is he alone?" Another pause, longer this time. Ruth's eyes dropped to the floor. "No, ma'am." Eliza set her wineglass on the window ledge. She smoothed her skirts once. Then she turned and walked through the crowded hall, her chin level and her shoulders back, because she was a Caldwell, and Caldwells did not let people see them coming apart. She found Jonathan sooner than she expected. He wasn't hiding. That was the first thing that struck her. He wasn't tucked into a corner or obscured by a curtain. He stood in the center of the room, illuminated by the candlelight from 3 chandelier arms. His hand rested on the small of Clara Whitmore's back with a familiarity that turned Eliza's stomach to stone. Clara Whitmore, 22, dark-eyed, her head tilted back as she laughed at something Jonathan had said, her throat exposed, the Caldwell family sapphire pendant glittering at her collarbone. Eliza stopped moving. That sapphire had belonged to her grandmother. Jonathan had taken it from the family jewel box 6 months ago. He had told Eliza it needed to be reset, that the clasp was faulty, that it would be returned. He had said it the same way he said most things, smoothly, easily, with that half-smile she had once found charming, and now recognized as the face of a man who had never once told her the full truth about anything. The sapphire hung at Clara Whitmore's throat, catching the light with every breath. Clara laughed again. Jonathan leaned close to her ear. Whatever he said made her press her hand to his chest. Around them, people noticed. People always noticed. The conversations didn't stop. They lowered, shifted, angled toward the spectacle while pretending to aim elsewhere. Eyes cut toward Eliza. Some faces showed pity. Some showed something uglier. A few women behind their fans were already whispering. Eliza felt it. She felt every single stare. She walked forward. She crossed the floor at an even pace. Not rushed, not hesitant. Jonathan saw her coming, when she was perhaps 10 feet away. Something shifted in his expression. Not guilt, not remorse. It was calculation, she realized. He was already deciding what to say, already constructing the story. She didn't give him the chance. "Jonathan." Her voice was quiet, steady as river stone. "Eliza." He stepped slightly, not much, but enough. A fraction of distance opened between him and Clara. "I didn't realize you'd come over. We were just—" "I'm sure you were." She looked at Clara then. Clara's smile had gone careful. The hand that had been on Jonathan's chest had retreated to her own side. "That is my grandmother's sapphire you're wearing." Clara's chin lifted. "Jonathan gave it to me." Jonathan did not have the right to give it to anyone. Eliza's tone did not rise. It did not need to. It belongs to the Caldwell family. It has belonged to the Caldwell family for 40 years. He borrowed it. He did not own it to gift. Jonathan's jaw tightened. "Eliza, this is not the time." "When would be the time, Jonathan?" She turned to look at him then, fully, and she let him see her face. Not the grief, not yet, just the knowing. "When would be the correct moment for me to point out that the man I am engaged to has placed my grandmother's jewels on his mistress?" The word hit the air like a stone into still water. Rings spread outward through the room. Conversation stuttered. The fiddle player missed a note. Clara drew a sharp breath. "I am not. Do not." Eliza's voice had a new edge in it now. Not cruelty, certainty. "Do not insult me further by finishing that sentence. I have eyes. I have had eyes for quite some time. I have simply been waiting." She glanced back at Jonathan. "I have been waiting to see if you would stop. If you had a single ounce of the character I once believed you possessed." Jonathan said nothing. That silence was its own answer. Eliza reached down. She pulled the gold band from her finger with one smooth, unhurried motion. She held it for a moment, just a moment, and something in her chest broke with a quiet, private sound that no one in that room would ever hear. Then she set the ring on the table beside Clara's elbow. "Keep it," she said. "I am done." The ring spun once on the polished wood, caught the candlelight, came to rest, and Jonathan Harrington screamed. It was not a dignified sound. It was raw and furious, and it came from somewhere beneath all the smooth charm and calculated grace he had cultivated over his 30 years of life. His hand swept across the table. Crystals shattered, wine sprayed in a dark arc across someone's white cravat. A candelabra toppled and had to be caught by a house servant before the tablecloth caught fire. He seized a chair back. He shoved it aside. The noise of it, the crash, the gasping, the scramble of guests stepping back filled the hall. "You do not walk away from me," he said. His voice was shaking. "You do not walk away from this family, from this house, from everything I have built." "You did not build it," Eliza said. She had not moved. "My father's shipping contracts built it. My inheritance funded it. Your name is on the deed of this plantation because I allowed it to be, because I was young, and I trusted you, and I believed you were something you were not." She picked up the skirts of her green gown with both hands. "The deed, as your own solicitor will confirm, remains in the Caldwell Trust, which means, Jonathan, that you are standing in my house having a tantrum in my dining hall in front of my guests." She turned. "Eliza," his voice broke. For 1 second, it sounded almost human, almost like remorse. "Eliza, you don't understand what you're doing. There are arrangements, agreements. You can't simply watch me." She did not turn back. She walked to the entrance hall. She took her wrap from the peg near the door where Ruth had already gone ahead to retrieve it. Ruth, who had known, who had always known, who had been watching and waiting for this night with quiet dread. Eliza settled the wrap over her shoulders. She walked out through the front door into the thick summer night. She did not look back at the house. She sat in the carriage alone for the first several miles, watching the dark fields pass, listening to the frogs along the creek beds and the steady rhythm of the horses. She was breathing carefully, in through the nose, out through the mouth, the way her father had taught her when she was 10 years old and had learned that her mother would not recover from the fever that had taken her in the spring. "You're allowed to feel it," her father had said, holding both her hands in the parlor while she tried not to cry. "Feel it all the way down, then you put it somewhere safe, and you decide what comes next." She felt it now, all the way down. The sapphire at Clara's throat. Jonathan's hand on the small of her back. 3 years. 3 years of suspension, folded neatly away because the alternative, the acknowledgement of what she already knew, had seemed too large, too devastating, too final. She was finished being afraid of final. By the time the carriage rolled through the iron gates of her family's estate on the edge of the city, Eliza Caldwell had stopped crying. She sat straight. She folded her hands in her lap, and she began, in the silence of that summer night, to think. The Caldwell house was older than the Harrington plantation by 15 years, and quieter by nature. Her grandfather had built it without the theatrical excess that newer wealth favored. No sweeping staircases meant to impress visitors, no fountain in the entrance courtyard, no gilt on everything that could be gilded. It was a house built to last, solid, purposeful, full of the kind of understated confidence that didn't need to announce itself. Eliza had always loved it for that. She was in the study before sunrise. Mr. Josiah Higgins, her father's solicitor, now hers, arrived at 7 in the morning, summoned by a note she had sent the night before. He was a small man, 62, with wire-rimmed spectacles and the careful manner of someone who had spent decades carrying other people's secrets and had learned to treat them like something fragile. He had known Eliza since she was a child. He had been present when her father's will was read. He had explained twice, with great patience, the nature and scope of the Caldwell Trust. She had listened then, with the abstract attention of someone who expects the information to remain theoretical. She was not abstract now. "Sit down, Mr. Higgins," she said. "Tell me everything." He removed his hat. He sat. He opened his leather case and he told her. The Harrington finances had been deteriorating for 4 years. Jonathan's cotton speculation, a series of ventures he had entered without consulting Eliza, without consulting anyone with genuine knowledge of the markets, had failed in 1812 and again in 1813. He had borrowed. He had borrowed more. He had borrowed against assets he did not own and made promises he could not keep. And somewhere in the compounding wreckage of his own poor judgment, he had made contact with Cornelius Whitmore. Eliza sat very still. Clara's uncle. "Yes, ma'am." Mr. Higgins' voice was careful. "Mr. Cornelius Whitmore has been expanding his railroad holdings aggressively over the past several years. He is a man of considerable means and considerably fewer scruples. He identified Mr. Harrington's debt some time ago and acquired it quietly through intermediaries. What Mr. Whitmore possesses effectively is leverage over Mr. Harrington's remaining holdings. And what does Mr. Whitmore want in exchange for that leverage?" Mr. Higgins looked at her over his spectacles. "Access to Caldwell shipping routes." The room was very quiet. "He wants to use my father's shipping contracts," Eliza said. "Our Atlantic merchant agreements. Our port access in Charleston, Boston, Philadelphia." "Yes, ma'am." "And he believed Jonathan could deliver those." He may have believed that Mr. Harrington wielded more sway over those holdings than he actually possessed. Mr. Higgins paused. "The trust, as I've explained before, is irrevocable. Your late father was a meticulous man. The Caldwell shipping interests, the estate, the merchant agreements, none of it can be transferred, leveraged, or signed away without your express written consent. Your consent and yours alone." Eliza's gaze drifted to the desk, her father's desk, broad oak, worn smooth at the edges from decades of use. "So, Jonathan brought me to that dinner," she said slowly, "in front of witnesses, in front of Clara and her uncle's interests, hoping to pressure me into signing something. It would be my assessment, yes, and the engagement, the 3 years of it." She stated it without a flicker of emotion, organizing the facts in her mind the way she'd learned to arrange cargo manifests and shipping ledgers, each item in its proper column. "He was never interested in me. I cannot speak to his personal feelings, Miss Caldwell." "No." She was quiet for a beat. "But you can speak to the trust." "Yes, ma'am. I can speak to that very clearly." She looked up. "Then let us begin. Clara Whitmore arrived at the house the following afternoon, uninvited. Eliza was in the garden when Ruth came to find her, and she saw a flicker of something cautionary, perhaps in Ruth's eyes, before Ruth spoke. "Miss Clara Whitmore is at the door, ma'am. She says she needs to speak with you privately." Eliza was quiet for a moment, her fingers tracing the thorns along a cutting from one of her mother's rose bushes, deep red summer blooms. She set it down. "Show her in." Clara looked different in daylight, less triumphant. The sapphire was gone from her throat. That absence was the first thing Eliza noticed, and the carefully constructed composure Clara had worn the previous night had cracked in the harsh afternoon light. "Eliza," she began, then corrected herself. "Miss Caldwell? Sit down, Miss Whitmore." Clara sat, not looking comfortable in the Caldwell parlor, which Eliza suspected was precisely the intended effect. This was Eliza's territory, her walls, her furniture, her air. "I came to explain," Clara began. "You don't need to explain anything to me," Eliza said, her voice pleasantly calm. That was the most unsettling thing about it. "You made your choices. Jonathan made his. I have made mine. What I am curious about, Miss Whitmore, is what you want." Clara blinked. You didn't come here to apologize. If you had come to apologize, you would have been wringing your hands on my doorstep last night, not arriving composed at 2 in the afternoon. So, you came here wanting something. What is it?" A long pause. Clara's jaw worked slightly. Your uncle has leveraged a foolish man's debt against assets that are not available for leveraging," Eliza stated. "Mr. Higgins explained the structure of the Caldwell Trust to me in considerable detail this morning. I suspect your uncle is finding that Jonathan Harrington was not the asset he believed him to be." Clara's face shifted. The performance she'd brought with her, the careful, slightly remorseful presentation, slipped enough to reveal something harder beneath. "My uncle is not a man who takes losses without response." "No," Eliza agreed. "I don't imagine he is. He will make things very difficult. I don't doubt it." Eliza looked at her steadily. "He is welcome to try." Clara stood, the softness entirely gone now. "You don't know what you're walking into, Miss Whitmore." Eliza's voice did not change. Calm, even, unafraid. "My father built a shipping empire from 3 vessels and a single merchant contract. He did it by understanding completely which fights were worth having and which men were bluffing." She tilted her head slightly. "I have been studying that man's methods since I was old enough to read a ledger. Cornelius Whitmore is a railroad man. He does not understand the sea, he does not understand shipping, and he does not understand me." Clara held her gaze for one more moment, then turned and walked out. Eliza listened to the front door close. She sat for a long time in her mother's parlor, in the silence of the summer afternoon, the heat pressing against the windows, the red roses turning their faces toward the sun. She was not afraid. She was, for the first time in 3 years, completely clear. She knew what had been done to her. She knew who had done it. She knew the shape of the trap that had been constructed around her father's legacy, and she knew, with a certainty that went all the way down to the floorboards, that she was not going to let it close. She pulled a sheet of writing paper from the table beside her, dipped her pen, and began to write. The letter she wrote that night was not to Jonathan. It was to Captain Aldous Frey. Frey had commanded the Caldwell fleet's primary Atlantic route for 11 years. A lean, sun-weathered man of 50, he had learned seamanship from Eliza's father and had never once, in all his years of service, taken an order from anyone other than a Caldwell. He was in Boston when the note reached him. He read it once, folded it, placed it inside his coat, and began making arrangements within the hour. Eliza did not wait for his reply before she moved to the second letter. That one went to Mr. Prentice Hale in Philadelphia, her father's oldest merchant partner, a dry, meticulous man who had built his own considerable fortune on the back of Atlantic trade and who harbored a deep, abiding dislike of anyone he considered a speculator. She had met Cornelius Whitmore once at a Philadelphia dinner 2 years before. She had watched Prentice Hale watch Whitmore across the table with the expression of a man watching someone track mud across a floor he had just cleaned. She remembered that expression now, with great clarity. She wrote to him plainly, no flattery, no softening, just the facts laid out in her father's manner. Direct, organized, unemotional on the surface, and absolutely furious underneath. Ruth came in at 10 with a lamp and set it on the desk without a word. She looked at the stack of written correspondence. She looked at Eliza. "You eating tonight?" Ruth asked. "Later. You said that at supper." "I meant it more now." Ruth set a plate of bread and cold chicken on the edge of the desk and left without comment. Eliza ate without tasting it and kept writing. By midnight, she had sent 6 letters. By the following morning, she had a reply from Prentice Hale. He had written back by return rider, which meant he had been awake when her letter arrived, or had woken someone to bring it to him immediately. Either possibility told her what she needed to know. He had written 3 sentences. The first confirmed he understood her situation. The second told her he was already aware of Cornelius Whitmore's recent acquisition activities, and that he had his own reasons for finding them inconvenient. The third sentence said, "Come to Philadelphia. Come soon." She was on the road north within the week. She did not tell Jonathan she was leaving. She did not tell anyone connected to the Harrington household. She told Ruth, she told Mr. Higgins, and she told Thomas, the Caldwell coachman, who had driven her father to meetings across 3 states for 20 years, and who she knew without question would carry her to the edge of the world and back, without asking a single unnecessary question. The journey took 4 days. She spent the hours reading shipping ledgers, contract documents, the notes her father had kept in his neat, compressed hand about the merchant agreements that formed the backbone of the Caldwell business. She had read some of them before. She read them differently now. She was not reading as an heir trying to understand an inheritance. She was reading as a woman preparing for a fight. She arrived in Philadelphia in the first heat of a July afternoon, with road dust on her skirts, and a clarity behind her eyes that the 4 days of study had sharpened to something close to an edge. Prentice Hale met her in his office, not his parlor, not the drawing room where social calls were received, but the office where real business happened. That choice told her something too. He was a small man with large hands and a blunt manner that some people found rude, and Eliza had always found restful. He stood when she entered. He did not waste time. "You understand what Whitmore is trying to do," he said. It was not a question. "He wants the shipping routes," she said. "He needs Atlantic port access to make his railroad investment profitable. Jonathan's debts were the mechanism. I was supposed to be the last step, and the engagement?" Hale's eyes were sharp. "How long do you think that was arranged?" Eliza sat down across from him. She had thought about this on the road, turning it over in the long hours of travel, examining it from every angle. "I don't know precisely," she said, "but I think Jonathan's feelings toward me were genuine in the beginning. I think they became less relevant to him as his financial situation worsened." She paused. "I think Cornelius Whitmore saw an opportunity and helped Jonathan see how to use it. Whether Jonathan resisted that suggestion for a long time or a short time, I cannot say." Hale made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "You're being generous." "I'm being accurate. Generous would be forgiving it. I have no intention of doing that." He leaned back in his chair and regarded her for a moment. "Your father would have liked to see you in this room," he said. "He talked about you, you know. He used to say you had the sharpest commercial mind he'd ever met, and it was a pure waste that the world wasn't going to let you use it." Something moved through her chest. She did not show it. "He was right about the first part," she said. "I intend to prove him wrong about the second." Hale smiled for the first time. It was small and brief and genuine. Then, "Let me tell you what I know about Cornelius Whitmore's current position." What he told her took the better part of 2 hours. Whitmore's railroad expansion had been more aggressive than it appeared from the outside. He had extended himself financially in ways that were not yet visible in public, buying land, securing contracts, hiring engineering teams for routes that had not yet been approved by state legislatures. He had capital, yes. He had influence, yes. But he was also, as Hale put it with characteristic bluntness, stretched thinner than he looks. The Caldwell shipping routes were not just desirable to him, they were necessary. The railroad lines he was building in the Carolinas would need to connect to Atlantic shipping to make commercial sense. Raw goods inward, manufactured goods outward, the whole system circular and dependent. Without reliable port access, without the merchant agreements that the Caldwell family had spent 40 years building, his Southern Railroad investment would be an expensive monument to overreach. "He needs you," Hale said. "He doesn't want you to know that, but he needs you." How long before his position becomes untenable without the shipping access? 18 months. Perhaps 2 years if he's careful. Hale paused. But he won't be careful. Men like Whitmore are never careful when they feel time pressing on them. They push harder. They make mistakes. Eliza looked at the papers spread across the desk between them. Her father's contracts, her father's roots, 40 years of built trust with harbor masters and merchant houses from Charleston to Boston. "Then we don't give him time to be careful," she said. "We tighten." Hale tilted his head slightly. "Meaning?" "I want to pull the Caldwell fleet from any route that overlaps with Whitmore's current shipping interests. Not all at once, gradually. I want him to start feeling friction before he understands where it's coming from." She tapped one of the contract pages. "And I want to have conversations with 3 or 4 of the harbor masters he's been trying to court, quietly, before he gets to them." Hale was quiet for a moment. "Your father would have truly liked this," he said. A shadow crossed her face, no smile. "I need his contacts, Mr. Hale. The ones he truly trusted, not those who merely claimed his trust. Can you discern the difference?" He opened his desk drawer, producing a list he'd evidently prepared before her arrival. She studied it for a long moment, then looked up. "You were already anticipating this." "I've been observing Cornelius Whitmore for 2 years," Hale stated plainly. "I was waiting for someone with both standing and motive. You walked through my door with both." He slid the list across the desk. "I believe that makes us allies, Miss Caldwell." She took the paper. "Then let's not waste another moment of each other's time." They worked through the afternoon and into the evening. By the time the last candle flickered low, Eliza had secured 3 commitments from harbor contacts, a clear understanding of Whitmore's vulnerabilities, and a timetable that was far from comfortable, yet precisely as aggressive as required. She was at her lodgings, nearly asleep, when a sharp knock echoed at her door. She sat up. It was well past 11. Ruth emerged from the adjoining room, a lamp in hand, her expression already taut with alertness. The knock came again. "Who is it?" Eliza called out, her voice carrying. "Carrie, Thomas, miss," the coachman's voice, low and tense. "Begging your pardon for the hour. There's a man downstairs, says he's from Mr. Harrington, says it's urgent." Eliza and Ruth exchanged a significant look. "Tell him to wait," Eliza instructed. "I'll be down in 10 minutes." She dressed with swift, unceremonious efficiency. A plain day dress, her hair not fully arranged. A deliberate choice. She wanted anyone Jonathan had sent to see her exactly as she was. Not flustered, not dressed for show, simply a woman in complete command of her own domain, even when summoned from her bed at midnight. The man waiting in the parlor was a stranger, young, impeccably dressed, attempting an air of professional composure that didn't quite land. He rose as she entered. "Miss Caldwell?" He extended an envelope. "Mr. Harrington sends his regards. He asks that you read this at your earliest convenience." Eliza accepted the envelope, but didn't open it in his presence. "How did you know where I was staying?" The young man hesitated, a fraction too long. "Mr. Harrington has connections in—" "He had me followed," Eliza stated, her voice even. She watched his face, his delayed denial confirming her suspicion. "Tell Mr. Harrington I received his letter." She turned toward the stairs. "And tell him that having me followed is not a strategy that will improve his situation." She ascended to her room without opening the envelope. Not until she was seated at the small writing desk, the lamp turned high. Ruth stood near the door, arms crossed. The letter was in Jonathan's hand. She recognized his script instantly, the broad, sweeping strokes of a man who had long ago accepted the compliment of elegant penmanship and never let it go. It was 3 pages long. She read it once, quickly, to grasp its shape. Then, she read it again, slowly, to absorb its intent. On the surface, it was a letter of reconciliation. He was sorry. He had behaved abominably. He had been under impossible financial strain, had made terrible choices, and Clara had meant nothing to him, never anything of true consequence. He hoped Eliza could find it within herself to consider what they had built together before utterly destroying it. By the second page, the tone had shifted. He spoke of trust, carefully oblique, but he spoke of it. He mentioned that Mr. Higgins might not have fully explained the complexities of Eliza's legal standing. He alluded to certain rights available to him as her intended husband, rights she might not have fully considered. Without naming Cornelius Whitmore directly, he warned of impatient parties and suggested Eliza's current actions were attracting unwanted attention. The third page was a veiled threat. Eliza set the letter down on the desk, pressing her hands flat against the wood. She breathed. Then, she picked up her pen and wrote a single sentence on a fresh sheet of paper. She folded it, sealed it, and handed it to Ruth. "Give that to Thomas," she said. "He'll know what to do with it in the morning." Ruth eyed the folded note. "What does it say, if you don't mind my asking?" "It says," Eliza replied, "that if Mr. Harrington intends to pursue legal means to access the Caldwell Trust, he is welcome to do so. And I look forward to having Mr. Josiah Higgins explain in open court the complete history of how the Harrington plantation's finances came to be in their current condition." Ruth was silent for a moment. "That'll shake him." "It'll do more than shake him," Eliza said, blowing out the lamp. "Go to sleep, Ruth. We have meetings in the morning." The meetings began at 8 o'clock. The first was with a harbor master named Declan Shaw, a stout man from Connecticut who had worked with Eliza's father for 12 years. He received her in his counting house with the particular respect reserved for those whose word had proven reliable over a long span of time. He wasn't surprised to see her. Prentice Hale had written ahead, and he had been expecting her. "Whitmore's man came to me in May," Shaw said, pouring 2 cups of coffee with the matter-of-fact air of someone accustomed to conducting serious business without flourish. "Offered good terms. Better than good. I told him I'd consider it." "Were you going to accept?" Shaw handed her a cup. "I was going to accept if nobody with a better reason to say otherwise showed up." He looked at her steadily. "You're here." "I'm here," she agreed, "and I'm asking you to hold." "For how long?" 6 months, she replied. "Perhaps a year. I need time to stabilize the Caldwell roots and make them genuinely more valuable to you than Whitmore's offer. I'm not asking you to take a loss. I'm asking you to wait for a better deal than he can ultimately deliver." Shaw studied her for a moment. He was not a man swayed by sentiment. She knew that much from her father's notes. He made decisions through calculation. She let him calculate. "Your father once told me something," Shaw said finally. "He said the Caldwell name was worth more than the Caldwell ships because the ships could sink, but the name had never gone underwater." He set his cup down. "You've got the name. I'll hold." She left his counting house 30 minutes later and proceeded directly to her second and then her third meeting. By late afternoon, she had secured 4 commitments, 4 harbor contacts, 4 sets of merchant agreements, 4 positions along the Atlantic coast, from which Cornelius Whitmore's reach was now quietly and legally beginning to be curtailed. She did not celebrate. She entered everything into a ledger, double-checking the numbers. It was Ruth who brought her the news that shifted everything. It arrived by rider from Charleston from Mr. Higgins, sent with urgent haste. Eliza read it standing in the middle of the lodging-house parlor, still in her coat from the afternoon's meetings, and for the first time in days, she felt something other than cold, strategic clarity. She felt fury. Jonathan had moved faster than she'd anticipated. He had filed a legal petition in Charleston, not through the usual channels, but through a circuit judge whose name appeared in several of the documents Hale had shown her. A judge who had professional and financial ties to Cornelius Whitmore that were not advertised, but were not invisible to someone who knew where to look. The petition argued that Eliza, as Jonathan's intended wife, had abandoned the engagement without legal cause, had acted against the financial interests of the Harrington household, and had placed the Caldwell Trust assets at risk through reckless unilateral decisions. It sought a temporary court order blocking any further changes to the Caldwell shipping contracts until the matter could be heard. It had already been granted. Eliza read to the end of the letter. Then she read it again. Then she folded it very carefully and put it in her coat pocket. "Bad news?" Ruth asked from the doorway. "Complicated news," Eliza replied, turning to face her. "They moved quickly." "Quicker than you expected?" "Yes." She paused. "Which means they were more worried than they let on." She crossed to the writing desk, sat down, pulled out a fresh sheet of paper, and began writing. Not to Hale, not to a harbor contact. She wrote to Mr. Higgins first, with specific instructions about the trust documents she needed and the legal precedents she wanted researched before she returned to Charleston. Then she wrote to a second solicitor, a man in Philadelphia she had identified from her father's notes as someone her father had trusted implicitly in matters of contested legal standing, someone who knew courts, someone with no ties to any interests in the Carolinas. She wrote swiftly, her hand steady. When she finished, she leaned back and gazed at the wall. She thought of the judge's name on that petition. She thought of Cornelius Whitmore in his railroad offices, calculating distances, returns, and pressures. She thought of Jonathan, who had sent her a 3-page letter of near reconciliation with one hand, while filing a legal petition with the other. She thought of her father, sitting at his desk in the early morning, poring over manifests before the rest of the household awoke. He had told her once, "The people who move against you at night are afraid of what you'll do in the daylight. Don't give them the cover of your silence." She was not going to be silent. She stood, put on her coat, gathered her letters, and went to find Thomas. She had one more meeting to arrange before morning, one not on Prentice Hale's list, one she had been turning over in her mind since she read the name on the legal petition. If Jonathan and Cornelius Whitmore wanted to use the courts, she would use them better, and she was already 3 moves ahead. The Philadelphia solicitor's name was Edmund Cray. He was 58 years old, stout, with the unhurried manner of a man who had spent 3 decades watching others panic in courtrooms and had concluded that panic was almost always counterproductive. He had worked with Eliza's father twice, once in a disputed cargo case in 1801 and again in a merchant licensing matter in 1806. Both times, according to her father's notes, he had won not by being louder than the opposing side, but by being more prepared. Eliza arrived at his office at 7:30 in the morning, before his clerk had unlocked the front door. She waited on the steps. When Cray himself appeared 20 minutes later, coat half-buttoned, coffee in hand, he stopped when he saw her and looked at her for a long moment with the assessing expression of a man recalibrating his morning. "You're Robert Caldwell's daughter," he said. "I am. I heard he passed 2 years ago." A pause. "I was sorry to hear it. He was a man worth arguing beside." He unlocked the door and held it open. "Come in then. Tell me what they've done." She told him everything. She did not soften it, did not arrange it for sympathy, laid it out exactly as it was. The engagement, the debt, the sapphire, the night in the hall, the legal petition, the judge's name. Cray listened without interruption. He drank his coffee. His expression did not change much, but his eyes sharpened progressively as she spoke, like a blade catching the light at the right angle. When she finished, he set his cup down. "Judge Aldrin Poe," he said. The name came out flat, like a fact being identified rather than a person being named. "You know him?" "I know of him. He has made certain decisions over the past 4 years that have been convenient for railroad interests in the Carolinas. Cray tapped one finger on the desk once. Filing the petition through Poe wasn't a misstep on their part. It was a calculated move. They were aiming for a swift approval, and they achieved it. Can it be contested? Anything can be contested. He met her gaze. The crux of it is whether you intend to challenge the order itself or strike at the very foundation it's built upon. Eliza held his gaze. I intend to strike at the foundation. Cray almost allowed himself a smile. Your father certainly knew how to raise a daughter. He opened a desk drawer, retrieving a pad of paper. The petition alleges you broke off the engagement without valid legal grounds. The way it's phrased is crucial because it paints you as the one acting against reasonable expectations. If we can demonstrate that your actions were a direct and justifiable reaction to documented wrongdoing, not just personal pique, but outright financial fraud, then the petition won't hold the shape they've molded it into. What do you require from me? Documents. Every letter Jonathan ever sent you, all financial records you have access to through the trust. Any correspondence between Jonathan and Cornelius Whitmore that you can lawfully acquire. He paused. And I need the name of Harrington's solicitor, the one who actually grasps the true state of his finances. Eliza was silent for a beat. Mr. Harrington's solicitor is a man named Bertram Cole. He's also the man who drafted the initial engagement documents. Does Cole realize what Harrington used him for? That, Eliza said carefully, is a question I've been posing to myself. Find out, Cray instructed. A solicitor who understands he's been manipulated into facilitating fraud has two options: protect his client or protect himself. In my experience, those with families and reputations tend to choose the latter. He stood, extending his hand across the desk. I'll begin drafting the challenge to the temporary order this morning. You get me those documents. She shook his hand. His grip was firm and brief. One more thing, she said. How long? If everything you've told me is accurate and verifiable, he considered. 6 weeks to dismantle the petition, another month to establish counterclaims. But, Ms. Caldwell, he looked at her directly, they won't stand idly by while we work. Whatever their next move, they'll act before we're prepared. Factor that in. She already had. She was back in Charleston within the week. Mr. Higgins met her at the estate, 3 leather folders of documents in hand, and an expression she'd never seen on his face before. Not precisely distress, but the taut, pressurized look of a man burdened with news he'd dreaded delivering. Tell me, she said, before he could begin with pleasantries. Mr. Harrington came to this house yesterday, Higgins reported. He arrived in the morning, before I could be notified. He spoke with Thomas. Eliza froze. What did he say to Thomas? He informed Thomas that the estate would soon be transitioning to a joint management arrangement, and that Thomas's continued employment would hinge on his cooperation with that transition. Higgins paused. Thomas told him, and I quote directly, that he worked for the Caldwell name and nobody else, and asked Mr. Harrington to leave the property. Something eased, infinitesimally, in Eliza's chest. Good man. Yes, ma'am. However, Higgins continued, Jonathan also left a document, a proposed agreement. Higgins held out one of the leather folders. It's presented as a reconciliation offer. In essence, it's a request for you to temporarily cede management rights to the shipping contracts, pending the resolution of the legal matter. Eliza took the folder and opened it. She read it standing in the entrance hall, Higgins waiting patiently beside her. The document was dense, meticulously worded. A lawyer's meticulousness was evident in every qualifying clause. It was designed to appear reasonable. It was designed to seem like a compromise. Stripped of its careful phrasing, however, it was a transfer of operational control over everything her father had built, handed over to Jonathan, and by extension to Cornelius Whitmore, in exchange for the withdrawal of a legal petition that should never have been granted in the first place. She closed the folder. He brought this here himself, she said. He stood on my property and tried to hand this to my coachman. Yes, ma'am. He's more desperate than I realized. She handed the folder back to Higgins. That's useful. Come. She began walking toward the study. I need to review the trust documents again. There's a specific clause concerning legal challenges to management rights that I want to confirm. They worked through the morning and into the afternoon. By the time the light shifted and the heat began its slow retreat toward evening, Eliza had pinpointed 3 specific provisions within the trust documents that directly contradicted the claims in Jonathan's legal petition, provisions her father had penned with the precision of a man who had spent a lifetime observing others attempt to seize what he had built, and who had anticipated their methods with remarkable foresight. She was deep in the 3rd document when Ruth appeared at the study door. "Miss Eliza." Ruth's voice carried a quality Eliza recognized: careful, contained. The tone she used when the news was significant, and she was carefully managing its impact. "There is a caller at the door." "Who is it?" Ruth hesitated for a beat. "It's Mr. Bertram Cole." The room fell profoundly still. Eliza looked up from the document. She and Higgins exchanged a glance across the desk. Cole was Jonathan's solicitor, the man who had drafted the engagement documents, the man Edmund Cray had instructed her to find. He had come to her. "Show him in," Eliza said. Her voice was perfectly even. "And Ruth, would you please bring tea?" Cole was a man in his mid-50s, slender, precise in his movements, with the distinct bearing of someone who takes immense pride in his professional reputation and is currently experiencing the sensation of watching that reputation teeter on the brink of a precipice. He entered the study and paused upon seeing Higgins. "Miss Caldwell," he said, "I had hoped to speak with you privately." "Mr. Higgins is my solicitor," Eliza replied pleasantly. "He is as private as I get, Mr. Cole. Please, have a seat." He sat. He did not look at ease. His hands, usually held with great precision, were now exhibiting a noticeable tremor. "I won't waste your time," he stated. "I am here because I find myself in a position I did not foresee when I undertook certain work on Mr. Harrington's behalf." "Tell me about the position," Eliza said. Cole was silent for a moment. He seemed to be selecting something. Not his words, she suspected, but the degree of commitment those words would carry once spoken. A man deciding, as Cray had predicted, which of his values held greater weight. "I drew up the engagement documents in 1812, Cole said. "At that time, I was given to understand that the Caldwell shipping interests were to serve as collateral security for certain of Mr. Harrington's debts, pending the formalization of the marriage." He paused. "I was not informed that the Caldwell trust was irrevocable. I was told, specifically told, that the trust contained provisions allowing for a husband's management authority upon marriage." The atmosphere in the room shifted perceptibly. Higgins made a small sound beside her. "Who told you that?" Eliza inquired. "Mr. Harrington." Cole's jaw tightened. "And Mr. Whitmore's attorney, who was present at the initial consultation." Eliza maintained a placid expression. "So, the legal framework for the engagement was constructed upon the basis of false information regarding the trust." "Yes." The word escaped Cole as if it were something he had long been holding back. "I am a solicitor, Miss Caldwell. I drafted documents based on representations made to me by my client. If those representations were false, then the documents themselves are fraudulent instruments," Eliza stated quietly. Cole closed his eyes for a single second. Yes. The ensuing silence was not empty. It was pregnant, heavy with the weight of what had just been articulated, imbued with the particular gravity of a man in a respectable profession realizing he had been used as a pawn in someone else's scheme, and that the only path forward lay in acknowledging it. "Mr. Cole," Eliza said, "I am going to ask you a direct question, and I require a direct answer. Are you prepared to make a sworn statement to a court detailing the representations made to you by Mr. Harrington and Mr. Whitmore's attorney concerning the nature of the Caldwell Trust?" Cole opened his eyes. He looked at her steadily. "That is why I came." Eliza glanced at Higgins. Higgins was already opening the second leather folder. "Then," Eliza said, "let us begin." They worked for 2 hours. By the time Cole departed the study, Higgins had a preliminary written account, signed in Cole's own hand, outlining the misrepresentations made during the engagement arrangement, with specific dates attributed to specific individuals. It was not yet a formal sworn statement, but it was a foundation. It was the kind of document that, handed to Edmund Cray in Philadelphia, would fundamentally alter the landscape of everything. Eliza herself escorted Cole to the door. At the threshold, he paused. He turned to look at her with an expression that was not quite guilt, too late for pure remorse, but something adjacent to it. Something akin to the face of a man taking stock. "Your father was one of the finest men I ever dealt with professionally," he said. "I regret that I did not protect what he left you with more diligently." Eliza regarded him for a moment. "You are protecting it now," she said. "That matters." He nodded once, descended the steps, and climbed into his carriage. She watched it depart. She stood there for a long moment in the summer evening, the heat finally receding, the sky turning amber over the distant tree line, the air carrying the saline trace of the harbor 2 miles away. She thought about her father building this, all of it, every contract, every handshake, every late night at the desk, constructing something solid enough to endure after he was gone. She would not allow it to be dismantled by a frightened man and a railroad speculator. She returned inside. She was at her desk, writing to Cray, when Ruth knocked and entered without waiting, something she only ever did when something was amiss. "There are 2 men at the gate," Ruth announced. "They say they're process servers. They have a document from Judge Poe's court." Eliza's hand did not falter. She finished the sentence she was writing before looking up. "What does the document pertain to?" "They wouldn't say. Thomas is holding them at the gate." Eliza set her pen down. She stood. She straightened her jacket. "Tell Thomas to let them in. Have Higgins come to the front hall." She paused. "And Ruth, send my letter to Cray tonight. Tonight, not in the morning. Pay Thomas whatever it takes to get a rider on the road within the hour." Ruth was gone before she finished the sentence. The process servers were young, official, and visibly uncomfortable. They handed over the document with the stiff formality of men adhering to procedure in a situation they did not fully comprehend. Eliza accepted it, thanked them politely, and waited until they had retreated down the drive before opening it. Higgins read over her shoulder. The new order from Judge Poe's court was more sweeping than the first. It did not merely seek to freeze changes to the shipping contracts. It aimed to appoint a temporary trustee, a court-selected administrator, to oversee Caldwell Trust operations during the pending legal proceedings. The appointment was recommended, and the named trustee was a man named Warren Hadley, a Charleston attorney. Eliza knew the name. She had seen it in Prentice Hall's documents. Warren Hadley had acted for Whitmore interests on 2 occasions in the past 3 years. "They're trying to install their own man inside the trust," Higgins murmured, his voice very quiet. "Yes." Eliza folded the document. Her hands were steady. Her jaw was tight. "They are panicking. This is Miss Caldwell. If this order is upheld, it will not be upheld." She turned. "Because Bertram Cole walked in that door today, and what he told us changes everything about the legal foundation of this entire case." She looked at Higgins directly. "I need you to contact every judge in the Charleston circuit who is not Aldrin Poe. I need to know who has jurisdiction to hear a challenge to a trustee appointment, and I need that information before morning." Higgins was already moving. She went back to the study. She added 3 pages to her letter to Cray, the trustee appointment, Hadley's name, the accelerated timeline. She sealed it, handed it to Ruth, heard the front door close, and the sound of Thomas's voice in the yard a few minutes later as the rider was dispatched. Then she sat down at her father's desk in the quiet of the evening, and she breathed. They were pushing harder because they were scared. She understood that. A man like Cornelius Whitmore did not move this fast, did not expose this much of his legal machinery, unless he felt the ground shifting under him. He had expected Jonathan to deliver the Caldwell Trust through the quiet mechanism of an engagement and a marriage. When that mechanism broke, He had expected the petition to deliver it through the courts. When that was challenged, he had moved to the trustee gambit, the most aggressive play, yet the one that would, if it worked, put him inside the trust without Eliza's signature at all. Each escalation was a tell. Each aggressive move was evidence of how badly he needed this and how much he had committed to the expectation of having it. She thought about what Prentice Hale had said, "Stretched thinner than he looks." She thought about Cole's quiet voice in the study. "I was told the trust contained provisions allowing for a husband's management authority." She thought about Edmund Cray's steady hands and his words, "Attack the foundation." The foundation was cracking, not under her, under them, under the weight of what they had built on false ground. She pulled a fresh sheet of paper toward her. She had one more letter to write. Not to a solicitor, not to a harbor contact. This one was to a newspaper. Her father had believed, with the conviction of a man who had watched public opinion move markets, that the most powerful force in commerce was not law or money, it was reputation. Reputation was the thing that made men extend credit, enter contracts, shake hands across a table without a written guarantee. Reputation was the invisible architecture of every deal. Cornelius Whitmore's reputation in the Carolinas and in Philadelphia's merchant community was that of a shrewd, hard-driving man of business. That reputation was built on the impression that his dealings were aggressive but not fraudulent, that he pressed hard but stayed within the lines. If the lines turned out to be drawn in the wrong place, the reputation would not survive the discovery. Eliza was not going to publish anything, not yet. She did not have to. She simply needed the right person at the right paper to begin asking questions about Judge Poe, about Warren Hadley, about the pattern of legal decisions that had benefited Whitmore Railroad interests in the past 4 years. Questions properly asked by a competent journalist had a way of surfacing answers that no court order could suppress. She wrote the letter carefully. She named no names explicitly. She described a pattern. She explained where to look. She suggested that a man interested in the intersection of judicial decisions and railroad expansion might find the territory worth exploring. She signed it with her father's company seal, not her own name. She finished as the clock struck 10. The house had gone quiet around her. Ruth in her room. Thomas in the carriage house. Higgins gone home with his folders and his assignment. Just Eliza alone at the desk her father had used for 20 years in the house her grandfather had built to last. She thought about Jonathan in the Harrington plantation, wherever he was right now. Worried, she imagined. Angry, probably. Convinced still that the weight of law and money and male authority would eventually press her back into line. He had never understood what he was dealing with. Not really. He had looked at her and seen the fortune and the name and the face that went with the green silk gown, and he had not bothered to look at what was underneath it all. Her father had looked. Her father had always looked. She thought about him in this room in the early mornings, going over his manifests while the house slept, building the thing he was going to leave her. "You ready for what comes next?" she said to the empty room. The silence answered her the way her father always had, with patience, with steadiness, with the absolute bone-deep expectation that she was more than ready. She sealed the letter to the newspaper. Outside, the summer night pressed its heat against the windows, and from somewhere down toward the harbor the tide was coming in. The reply from Edmund Cray arrived 9 days later. It was not a letter, it was a packet thick sealed with wax on 3 separate folds, the kind of packet that meant Cray had been working every hour since her correspondence reached him. She opened it at the desk before Thomas had even fully closed the study door, and she read standing up, one hand braced on the wood, the way her father used to read urgent manifests off the ships. Cray had filed the challenge to the temporary order. He had done it not in Judge Poe's court. He had gone around Poe entirely, filing in the federal circuit, on the grounds that the petition improperly reached into the administration of a trust established under interstate commerce provisions. It was a narrow argument. It was, as he noted in his accompanying letter, the kind of narrow argument that either worked completely or collapsed completely, with very little middle ground. But it had worked. The federal filing had triggered an automatic stay on Judge Poe's trustee appointment. Warren Hadley Whitmore's man, the one they had tried to install inside the trust, was blocked from taking any administrative action pending the federal review. The temporary order freezing the shipping contract changes was still technically in place, but its enforceability was now in question. Eliza read that page twice. Then she read the last paragraph of Cray's letter. He had received Cole's preliminary account. He had reviewed it against the engagement documents. His assessment, written in the measured language of a man who did not exaggerate, was that the misrepresentations Cole had identified constituted actionable fraud, not civil negligence, not contractual ambiguity, but deliberate fraud perpetrated against both Eliza and Cole himself by Jonathan Harrington, and by documentary association, by Whitmore's attorney. If the sworn statement held, the petition did not just lose its legal footing, it became evidence of the crime it was designed to conceal. Eliza set the packet down. She pressed both hands flat on the desk and breathed once slowly. "Mr. Higgins," she said. He was already there, had been reading over her shoulder for the last 3 paragraphs. "Yes, ma'am. I need Cole brought back in today. Today, not tomorrow. I need his sworn statement properly witnessed and notarized, and I need copies sent to Cray, sent to the Federal Circuit Clerk, and kept here under lock." She straightened. "And I need Captain Frey. Where is the Caldwell Star right now?" Higgins consulted a page from his folder. "She made port in Baltimore 2 days ago. She's due to begin the return route south on Friday. Send word to Frey to hold at Baltimore until he hears from me." She moved toward the door. "I may need her repositioned." Higgins wrote quickly. "May I ask to where?" Eliza paused at the doorway. "I'm not sure yet, but I want the option." She was already thinking 3 moves ahead. Bertram Cole arrived at the estate by mid-morning. He looked like a man who had not slept well in 2 weeks, which was probably accurate. He sat across from Higgins at the study table, a notary present, the sworn statement laid out before him, and he read every line of it with the careful attention of a man understanding that what he was about to sign would define the remainder of his professional life. He signed it. Eliza witnessed it. She looked him in the eyes as he lifted the pen, and she said simply, "Thank you, Mr. Cole." He nodded once. He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. Within 2 hours, the copies were sealed and dispatched. One by private rider to Philadelphia, one to the Federal Circuit Clerk's office, one locked in the Caldwell Estate strongbox behind the false panel in the study wall, the same panel her father had built into the room in 1798. The one she had known about since she was 12 years old. She stood at the window after everyone had gone and let herself feel it for exactly 1 minute, the particular relief of having done something that could not be undone. Cole's signature, Cray's filing, the stay on Hadley's appointment, all of it now in motion, all of it real. 1 minute. Then she turned back to the desk and went to work. The newspaper letter produced its first result 4 days later. She did not know the journalist's name when his first inquiry appeared. It came through a roundabout channel, passed through a merchant contact in Charleston, who passed it to Higgins, who brought it to her, with the careful expression of a man unsure whether the thing he was carrying was a gift or a hazard. It was a single-page handwritten from a man who identified himself only as working for a Philadelphia publication. He had, he said, been looking into certain judicial decisions in the Carolina Circuit. He had some questions about the pattern of those decisions and their relationship to railroad land acquisition. He was interested in speaking with anyone who had direct experience of that pattern. He had signed with an initial only. Eliza read it once. Then she wrote back briefly, without her name, directing him to 3 specific public records that were legally accessible and would show, if he knew how to read them, the exact financial relationship between Judge Aldrin Poe and a landholding company that had transferred 2 parcels to Whitmore Railroad interests in 1813. She did not tell him what to conclude. She did not have to. A competent journalist could follow the thread from there. She sent the reply and went back to her shipping ledgers. It was Ruth who first told her that Jonathan had been seen in Charleston, Not at the estate in the city itself, at a merchant's exchange in conversation with men Eliza recognized as harbor contacts she had not yet secured. She heard this from Ruth, who had heard it from the wife of one of the Caldwell house staff, who had heard it from her cousin, who worked near the harbor. The information moved the way information always moved in Charleston, through the invisible networks of people the powerful men never thought to account for because they had never learned to look at those people as people who heard and remembered things. Eliza heard it and understood immediately what it meant. Jonathan was trying to go around her. He could not touch the trust. He could not install Hadley. The legal mechanisms were stalling, so he was going directly to the harbor contacts, trying to make his own agreements, or Whitmore's agreements, directly with the men who controlled port access, bypassing the Caldwell contracts entirely. It was not a stupid move. She had to give him that. It was just too late. She had been in those rooms first. She had made those relationships first. She had her father's name and her father's word and 20 years of built trust behind every handshake she had offered. Jonathan Harrington had charm and desperation and Cornelius Whitmore's money, and in a different situation that might have been enough, but Declan Shaw had already told her he would hold. The others had committed in writing, and a harbor master who had given his word to a Caldwell, she knew from her father's experience, did not unmake that commitment for a railroad man from the Carolinas without a very compelling reason. She let Jonathan make his rounds. She watched through her network. She waited. The compelling reason never materialized. 2 weeks after Cole's statement was filed, she received a letter from a name she had not expected. It was from Clara Whitmore, not the Clara who had come to the parlor with her carefully prepared expression and her vague threats. This letter was different. It was 3 pages handwritten in a hurried script that suggested it had been written quickly, perhaps more than once. She could see where phrases had been crossed out and rewritten. It began without salutation and ended without signature, but Eliza knew the hand from the brief note she had once received acknowledging a social invitation. Clara wrote that she was in Charleston. She wrote that her uncle had summoned her from Virginia, where she had been staying since the night of the dinner party. She wrote that her uncle was furious, a specific controlled fury that she described with the precise language of someone who had grown up in proximity to it and learned to recognize its gradations. She wrote that Jonathan's legal efforts had not produced what Whitmore had expected, and that her uncle had made clear to both of them, in terms she said she would not repeat in writing, what the consequences of continued failure would be. Then she wrote something that made Eliza go very still. She wrote that her uncle had been using her. That the arrangement with Jonathan had not been Clara's choice, not entirely. That Whitmore had identified Jonathan's debts 2 years before Clara had ever met him, and had engineered the introduction deliberately, and had made it clear to Clara, in the way that wealthy and powerful uncles make things clear to nieces with no independent income, that her cooperation was expected, that the sapphire given to her by Jonathan at her uncle's suggestion was meant to be seen at the party, meant to provoke exactly the rupture it had provoked. Because a broken engagement, Whitmore had calculated, would be easier to exploit legally than a completed one. Eliza read that page twice. Then she sat back in her chair and looked at the ceiling for a long moment. The rupture had been staged, not Jonathan's genuine affection for Clara. She believed after everything that some version of it had been real enough. But the timing, the public display, the sapphire worn precisely where it would be seen, all of it calibrated to push Eliza into exactly the action she had taken, removing the ring, leaving the engagement, creating the legal situation that the petition was designed to exploit. They had expected her to leave in grief and withdraw in shame, to retreat to the estate and weep, and eventually sign whatever was put in front of her to make the pain stop. They had made a very significant miscalculation about who Robert Caldwell had raised. She folded Clara's letter. She put it in the strongbox with Cole's statement. Then, she went to find Higgins. "I need to meet with Clara Whitmore," she said. "Privately, not here, somewhere in the city. A tea room, a parlor somewhere that is not connected to either of our households." Higgins looked at her carefully. "May I ask why?" "Because she has information I need." and she has a reason to give it to me." Eliza paused. "And because whatever she is not the person I was most angry at." Higgins arranged it through an intermediary. 3 days later, Eliza sat across from Clara Whitmore in a quiet back room of a tea house near the harbor, with no one else present but Ruth stationed near the door. Clara looked smaller than she had at the party. Not physically, but in the way a person looks when the performance they have been maintaining collapses, and what's left is just the actual human being underneath. She had shadows under her eyes. Her hands wrapped around a teacup were not entirely steady. "I wasn't sure you would come," Clara said. "I almost didn't." Eliza looked at her directly. "But your letter convinced me you were telling the truth. People who are still performing don't write the way you wrote." Clara's jaw tightened briefly. "I need to know that what I tell you won't be used against me." "I can't promise that," Eliza said. "What I can tell you is that my quarrel is with Cornelius Whitmore and with the fraudulent legal instruments he helped construct. If you are willing to speak honestly about what you witnessed, I will use that information against him, not against you." Clara stared at her teacup for a long moment. Then she looked up. "He kept records," she said. "My uncle keeps records of everything. He believes documentation protects him. Proof of agreements, proof of payments, proof that other people consented to things. A beat. He has correspondence with Jonathan going back nearly 3 years. He has the original communication from his attorney about the trust misrepresentation. He keeps it all in his office in Philadelphia." Eliza's pulse did not change. She was very careful about that. "Are those records accessible?" she asked. "I have been in his Philadelphia office twice," Clara said. "I know where they're kept." She paused. "I am not saying I will take them. I am saying I know where they are. And I am saying that my uncle does not expect me to be the person who helps dismantle him, because he has never once considered that I might have a reason to." The room was very quiet. "Why are you doing this?" Eliza asked, not as a challenge, as a genuine question. Clara looked at her with an expression that had something old and tired in it. The expression of a woman who has been a piece in other people's games for a long time and has finally decided she is done being moved around the board. "Because he told me what I was," she said quietly. "Collateral, his word. He called me collateral in a conversation he did not realize I was close enough to overhear." She put the teacup down. "I would rather be your instrument than his." Eliza studied her for a long moment. She thought about trust, about how it was built, about how much of what she had accomplished in the past weeks had depended on people making the choice to tell the truth when lying was still available to them. Cole had made that choice. Cray had built his career on other people making it. Shaw had made it over a cup of coffee without much deliberation at all. Clara had made it in a handwritten letter with half the sentences crossed out. "Tell me about the records," Eliza said. "Tell me everything you remember," Clara told her. It took 40 minutes. Eliza listened without interrupting, asking only 2 questions, both precise, both about dates and specific names. By the time Clara was done, Eliza had a clear enough picture to understand what Cray could do with the information and how. She did not need Clara to take the documents. She needed her to testify to their existence and their content, and to be willing to identify her uncle's handwriting and confirm the context of specific correspondence. That was a different kind of action, less legally dangerous for Clara, and arguably more useful. Clara agreed. She said it quietly with the flat steadiness of someone burning a bridge they had been standing on for a long time, and understanding fully that there was no going back across it. Eliza walked out of the tea house into the summer afternoon and sent Ruth ahead to find Thomas, while she stood for a moment on the street. She looked at the harbor in the distance, the masts of ships against the sky, the movement of goods and people and capital that her father had spent his life building and directing. All of it still there, all of it still hers. She sent Cray a detailed letter that evening, marked urgent, with Clara's information laid out in full. She included her assessment of Clara's reliability and her recommendation that Cray move quickly on the Philadelphia correspondence before Whitmore had reason to move or destroy it. Cray moved. He had contacts in Philadelphia who could file for documentary discovery in the federal proceeding, a formal legal mechanism that required Whitmore to produce under penalty the correspondence Clara had described. Filed before Whitmore knew that Clara had spoken, before he had any reason to believe the discovery was coming. The filing went in on a Thursday morning. By Thursday afternoon, Whitmore knew. Eliza learned this through Prentice Hale, who had people near Whitmore's offices and who sent word by fast writer Whitmore had been in his Philadelphia office when the discovery order was served. He had, according to Hale's contact, turned the color of old paper and dismissed everyone from the room. A man who was not afraid would not dismiss everyone from the room. Eliza read Hale's note and set it aside and went back to her ledgers. 2 days later, Jonathan came to the estate. He did not send a letter first. He did not send a proxy. He came himself, arriving at mid-morning, in a carriage that had seen better days. She noted the detail because it told her something about the current state of his finances. Thomas met him at the gate, as Thomas always did, and Thomas came to find her in the study where she was working, and said with the level expression of a man who had decided how he felt about this visitor and was simply reporting facts, "Mr. Harrington is at the gate. Miss Eliza says he'd like to speak with you." She set her pen down. She thought for a moment. Then she said, "Show him to the parlor, not the study." The study was hers. It had always been her father's room, and now it was hers. She was not going to have this conversation in that room. Jonathan looked different than he had the night of the party. The party version of Jonathan had been polished, smooth hair, good coat, the practiced ease of a man performing confidence for an audience. This Jonathan had something worn around the edges. His jaw was set in the hard line of someone holding something in. His eyes moved around the parlor when she came in, as if he were looking for something to fix on some stable point. He had none of his usual preamble. He said, "I need you to stop." Eliza sat down. She did not offer him a chair, and she registered that he noticed the absence of the offer and remained standing. "Stop what specifically?" she asked. "The federal filing, the discovery order." His voice was controlled, but she could hear what was under the control. Something raw, something close to panic, that he was working very hard to keep away from the surface. "Eliza, if Whitmore's records are made public in a federal proceeding, the damage to whom?" He stopped. "To whom, Jonathan?" she asked. Her voice was calm. "To Cornelius Whitmore, who constructed a fraudulent legal argument to access property that doesn't belong to him. To you for misrepresenting the nature of my trust to your own solicitor." She looked at him steadily. "Or to me, who was told 3 years ago that she was marrying a man of character and found out at a dinner party that she had been a financial instrument all along." Jonathan's face moved through several expressions in rapid succession. Anger, and then something beneath the anger that might in a different man have been shame. It wasn't only that," he said. "You know it wasn't." "What I know," Eliza said, "is that when your financial situation required you to choose between my welfare and your own, you made your choice very clearly." She stood. "I am not stopping the federal filing. I am not withdrawing Cray's challenge. I am not signing anything that transfers management of my father's trust to anyone with ties to Cornelius Whitmore." She looked at him directly, at the man she had spent 3 years believing was something he was not. "If you want to survive what comes next, Jonathan, I would suggest you speak to a solicitor, one who actually works for your interests this time, and think very carefully about what kind of arrangement protects you individually rather than Whitmore collectively." He stared at her. "You're telling me to separate from Whitmore." "I'm telling you to consider your own situation clearly." She moved toward the door. "Whitmore's attorney told your solicitor the trust was accessible. That makes Whitmore's side of this legally vulnerable, in a way that yours doesn't have to be if you cooperate with the federal proceeding, rather than obstruct it." She paused at the door. "That is not advice. That is an observation. Get your own solicitor." Jonathan stood in the middle of the parlor for a long moment. He looked like a man at the edge of something. A drop he had not seen coming. A distance he had not prepared to fall. "I'm sorry," he said. "It was very quiet. It did not sound performed. I know that doesn't fix anything. Eliza looked at him from the doorway. She felt something. Not forgiveness. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But something adjacent to sorrow for what she had believed this was once. For the person she had been at 21, standing in this house with a gold band on her finger and the reasonable expectation that the man who put it there meant what he implied by it. No, she said. It doesn't fix anything. She paused. But it's the most honest thing you've said to me in 3 years. That's worth something. She walked out. She heard him leave 20 minutes later, the carriage wheels on the drive, the gate closing at the end. She did not watch from the window. She went back to the study, sat down at her father's desk, and picked up her pen. There was still work to do. The federal proceeding was scheduled for the following month. Cray was in Philadelphia preparing. Cole's sworn statement was in the clerk's file. Clara's cooperation was documented and secured. Hale's merchant contacts had held. Shaw and the harbor masters were steady. Whitmore had one move left that she could see. He could produce the correspondence himself, preemptively with his own framing attached. It was what a smart man would do. Get ahead of the discovery, control the narrative, admit to the lesser thing before the greater thing was extracted from him by court order. She was preparing for that too. She wrote to Cray until the candle burned low, and then she lit another one and kept writing. Outside, the summer heat had finally broken the first time in weeks, and the evening air coming through the window was cleaner and sharper than it had been, carrying the salt of the harbor and the distant sound of water. The tide, as always, was moving. Cray's letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, and it was the shortest one he had ever sent her. 4 sentences. No preamble, no legal hedging, no careful qualifications. Just 4 sentences, written in the compact hand of a man who understood that some news did not need decoration. The federal court had reviewed the discovery order. Whitmore's attorney had attempted to block production of the correspondence on grounds of attorney-client privilege. The court had rejected the argument on the grounds that communications made in furtherance of a fraud were not protected. The correspondence would be produced in full at the scheduled proceeding. Eliza read it once, set it down, picked it up, and read it again. Then she walked to the window and stood there for a long moment with the letter in her hand and the morning light coming through the glass, and she let herself feel the full weight of what those 4 sentences meant. Not celebration, not yet. But the particular sensation of watching a structure that someone else had built on false ground begin to come apart at the seams slowly, then all at once. She had known it was coming. She had worked for weeks toward exactly this outcome, but knowing a thing is coming and feeling it arrive are different experiences entirely. And she stood at that window long enough to let herself feel it properly before she folded the letter and went back to the desk. Ruth appeared in the doorway with coffee and the look of a woman who could read a room without being told what was in it. Good news, very good news. Ruth set the coffee down. How good? Eliza looked up. The kind my father would have stayed up all night celebrating and then been at his desk before dawn anyway. Ruth smiled, a real one, not the careful managed expression she wore most of the time. Then I'll make a proper breakfast. The proceeding was 3 weeks away. Eliza spent those weeks in the way she had spent the past months, in motion, in correspondence, in the steady accumulation of position. She met twice more with Hale in Philadelphia, once by carriage, and once by correspondence, confirming that his merchant contacts remained solid and that the harbor commitments were intact. She received a letter from Captain Frey telling her the Caldwell Star had made port in Charleston and was standing by for instruction. She sent him a route, the standard Atlantic run, fully restored, the one that Whitmore had been trying to intercept since the beginning. The fleet moved. The routes opened, and Cornelius Whitmore's shipping alternatives, which had depended on the Caldwell access he had never actually secured, began to constrict around him like a closed fist. She was at the harbor herself when the Caldwell Star came in. She had not planned to go. She had been at the warehouse reviewing manifest with the harbor factor when the ship came into view, and she had walked outside without thinking about it, and stood at the edge of the dock and watched the vessel come in on the morning tide, the Caldwell flag at the mast. the crew moving with the practiced efficiency of men who had run this route 11 times a year for a decade. Frey was at the rail when the gangway went down. He saw her before he was fully off the ship and stopped where he was and took his hat off. "Miss Caldwell," he said. His voice had the rough warmth of a man who did not say many unnecessary things and meant everything he did say. "She's home." Eliza looked at the ship, at the hull her father had commissioned, at the lines her grandfather's money had made possible, at the flags snapping in the harbor wind. "Yes," she said. "She is." Frey came down the gangway. He was a lean man, deeply weathered with eyes that had spent decades reading weather and water. He looked at her the way people who had known her father looked at her sometimes, with an expression that was partly recognition and partly something that bordered on reverence. "I heard what happened," he said. "With Harrington, with Whitmore's people. I imagine most of the Atlantic coast heard something. I heard the real version." He put his hat back on. "From Shaw. He told me what you did in Philadelphia." He paused. "Your father would have I know," she said quietly. "Thank you, Captain." He nodded once. He understood her well enough not to push further. She watched the crew unload for a while, and then she went back to the warehouse, and back to the manifests, and back to work. 12 days before the proceeding, Jonathan separated from Whitmore. It happened through his solicitor, a new one, as she had suggested, a man from Columbia who had no ties to railroad interests and who filed the separation of legal interests in the federal matter with the kind of speed that suggested Jonathan had not spent much time deliberating. He also, through the same solicitor, withdrew the original petition, the one that had started all of it. The petition claiming Eliza had abandoned the engagement without cause, withdrawn voluntarily, without condition. Higgins brought her the withdrawal document in person, which told her he understood its significance. She read it at the desk and set it down and looked at the far wall for a moment. "He's going to testify," Higgins said carefully. "Against Whitmore." "I know." She had known it was coming since the conversation in the parlor. A man who separates from his co-conspirator 12 days before a federal proceeding is not doing it to sit quietly in a corner. He was going to give the court what it needed about Whitmore's role in the fraud in exchange for whatever accommodation his new solicitor had negotiated. What did he get? Higgins consulted his notes. Release from the outstanding debt Whitmore holds on the Harrington plantation, immunity from civil fraud charges, contingent on full cooperation, no criminal referral on the misrepresentation to Cole, provided the sworn testimony is complete. Eliza was quiet for a moment. She thought about whether that felt like justice, and decided it felt like outcome, which was sometimes the same thing, and sometimes not, and that she was going to make peace with the difference. "Fine," she said, "as long as Whitmore's exposure is complete. Cray believes it will be. Then that is what matters." The proceeding itself was held in a federal court in Philadelphia, in a room that was smaller than she had expected, and more ordinary wooden benches, tall windows, the smell of old paper and floor wax. She had been in her father's offices her whole life, and she had never been in a courtroom, and she spent the first 10 minutes simply adjusting to the reality of it. Cray sat beside her. Higgins sat behind. Ruth had come with her to Philadelphia, and was not in the room because she had not been permitted, which was one of the specific injustices of the world that Eliza filed away and did not forget. Cornelius Whitmore was across the room with 2 attorneys and an expression she recognized immediately. The expression of a man who has decided that the best remaining strategy is to project absolute confidence and hope that confidence alone can reshape the facts. He was heavier than she remembered from the Philadelphia dinner 2 years ago, and he did not look at her when she came in, which was its own information. His attorneys had clearly advised him not to look at her. Men who had nothing to fear looked at the people across the room from them. Men who had something to fear looked at their papers. Whitmore looked at his papers. The proceeding began. Cray presented the federal challenge to the trust petition, the original filing, the evidence of Whitmore's attorney's misrepresentations to Cole's sworn statement, the documented connection between Judge Poe and Whitmore land interests. He laid it out with the unhurried precision of a man who had built the structure beam by beam and was now simply walking the court through the architecture. Whitmore's attorneys objected 4 times. 3 of the objections were overruled. Then Jonathan was called. She had not spoken to him since the day he had stood in her parlor and said he was sorry. She had not known going into the proceeding exactly how she would feel watching him take the witness position. She watched him walk to it now, straight-backed, composed with the visible effort of a man holding himself together through pure determination of will, and she felt something complex that she could not simplify into a single word. Grief, maybe. Not for what she was losing, but for what had never been real. For the version of him she had believed in. He testified for 2 hours. He was thorough. She had not expected him to be thorough, had expected carefully limited cooperation, the minimum necessary for immunity. But he was thorough. He named dates, he named figures, he named the specific conversation in which Whitmore's attorney had told him the trust was accessible upon marriage. He described the pressure Whitmore had applied as his debts increased. He described the introduction to Clara, the role it was meant to play, the sapphire that had been Whitmore's suggestion. He described in detail the moment he understood that what he was doing was fraud, and continued doing it anyway because he was afraid and in debt, and had convinced himself that Eliza would sign eventually, and everything would be resolved before anyone had to name what it actually was. He did not look at Eliza during most of it. Near the end, he did briefly directly for just a moment, and the expression on his face was one she did not have a name for. Not a performance, not a strategy, just a man confronting the wreckage he'd wrought, finding it starker in the unfiltered glare of a federal courtroom than he'd ever perceived from within its shadow. She held his gaze, unwavering. She didn't flinch, didn't soften. She simply let him see that she was present, whole, and would, indeed, be fine. He turned back to the judge. Clara's account was next, submitted as a written affidavit. Cray had assessed that her direct testimony, though available, was less critical given the weight of documentary evidence. The affidavit detailed the arrangement with Whitmore, the pressure Clara had endured, and the orchestrated unveiling of the sapphire at the party. The court clerk read it into the record in a flat, official cadence that, paradoxically, amplified its impact. The bold language left no room for doubt about what had transpired and why. Whitmore's attorney attempted to challenge the affidavit's reliability. The judge posed a single question. Did Whitmore dispute Clara's presence at the pertinent meetings? When the attorney equivocated, the judge moved on. Then came the correspondence. 47 pages of it. Letters between Whitmore and his attorney. Letters between Whitmore and Jonathan. And a memorandum, penned in Whitmore's own hand from early 1812, outlining the Caldwell shipping routes. It described, with the dispassionate tone of a business plan, how access to these routes could be secured through the marriage of Jonathan Harrington to Eliza Caldwell, contingent on resolving the trust issue before the ceremony. Managing the trust question. That was the phrase he'd used. Eliza heard it read aloud and felt it course through her like icy water. She had been a trust question to be managed. She sat utterly still, breathing, refusing to meet Whitmore's gaze or cast her eyes to the floor. Instead, she focused on Cray's hands resting on the table before her, steady and unmoving, anchoring herself to that stillness as the 47 pages were entered, one by one, into the federal record. When the final page was read, a profound quiet settled over the room. The judge's gaze drifted to Whitmore's table. Does the respondent wish to address the court? Whitmore's lead attorney rose. He spoke for 11 minutes. It was, Eliza mused, an impressive performance, considering the material he had to work with. He acknowledged miscommunications, disputed intent, lauded Whitmore's contributions to Carolina commerce, and suggested the documentary record reflected aggressive business strategy, not deliberate fraud. When he concluded, the judge regarded him for a long moment before his eyes fell upon the stack of 47 pages of correspondence beside the clerk's bench. I have read the memorandum of February 1812, the judge stated. His voice was neither angry nor warm. It was the voice of a man who, through years of professional immersion in documents, had honed the skill of discerning true meaning from mere appearance. The phrase managing the trust question does not describe aggressive business strategy. It describes the deliberate manipulation of a legal instrument that the respondent knew he had no right to access. He paused. We will recess until tomorrow morning, at which time I will issue findings. The room rose. Eliza stood, her feet planted firmly. She had maintained that steadiness for 4 months and intended to hold it for the few remaining hours until this was concluded. Cray leaned in, his voice a low murmur. It's over, he said. He knows it. His attorneys know it. I know it, she replied. I have known it since Cole walked into my study. Cray looked at her, a familiar expression dawning. It was the look of a man who valued competence because he had built his life upon it and recognized it instantly in others. Your father was right about you, he said. I'm sorry I didn't know you sooner. She offered a single nod, unwilling to trust herself with more at that moment. She walked out of the courtroom into the Philadelphia afternoon, finding Ruth waiting in the anteroom, her coat draped over her arm, her expression conveying an unspoken question. Tomorrow morning, Eliza said. Then it's done. Ruth held out the coat. I'll find somewhere to get a decent supper. They found a quiet establishment 2 streets over, a place of plain food and plain rooms, the kind that asked no questions and offered no performances. Eliza ate without ceremony, conversing with Ruth about inconsequential matters, the harbor, the long-awaited break in the summer heat, the rose bushes her mother had planted, still blooming in the side garden of the Charleston estate. Ruth, who had known those roses for 30 years, offered opinions on their pruning with the quiet authority of a woman who had been right about most things for most of her life. Eliza listened, ate, and allowed the ordinary conversation to perform its grounding magic. When one has lived within the immensity of a consuming struggle, the mundane world reasserts itself, reminding you that life extends beyond the conflict, and that once resolved, the struggle becomes merely a chapter, not the entire story. She slept that night with surprising ease, a fact that then, itself, became a source of surprise. The judge's findings took 40 minutes to deliver. She stood for the entirety. The petition claiming Eliza had abandoned the engagement without legal cause was dismissed with prejudice, precluding refiling. The trustee appointment of Warren Hadley was permanently vacated. The temporary order freezing the Caldwell shipping contract changes was dissolved. The court found that Cornelius Whitmore, through his attorney, had knowingly made deliberate misrepresentations to Bertram Cole regarding the nature of the Caldwell Trust, intending to exploit these falsehoods for unlawful access to assets to which he had no legal claim. The matter was referred to the appropriate federal authority for review of potential criminal fraud charges. Judge Aldrin Poe, the findings noted, had also been separately referred to the Judicial Conduct Committee for review of his relationship with Whitmore land interests. As the judge concluded, Whitmore abruptly stood, murmured something to his lead attorney inaudibly, and departed before the formal adjournment. His attorney called out to him in a sharp, worried tone, but Whitmore did not stop. She watched him go, watched the door close behind him. She thought of the February 1812 memorandum. Managing the trust question. She thought of the sapphire at Clara's throat, precise and deliberate. She thought of 3 years with a gold band on her finger, and a man who had looked at her and seen only a shipping route. Anger was no longer present. It had receded. What she felt, standing in that federal courtroom, watching Cornelius Whitmore walk away, was something akin to completion. The sense of a long-standing account, finally, fully settled. Cray extended his hand, a smile gracing his face, a rare sight during the proceedings, and one that suited him. Congratulations, Miss Caldwell. Thank you, Mr. Cray, for everything. Don't thank me. He released her hand. I followed your strategy. I just filed the papers. She laughed, a sound that surprised her with its ease, its genuine warmth. She hadn't laughed in a long time. "Send me your bill," she said, "and send it to the correct address this time. The Caldwell Estate, Charleston." He grinned. "Yes, ma'am." She walked out of the courtroom, with Higgins following, Ruth already waiting at the door with her coat. No rush. Her pace was measured through the anteroom, the outer hall, and out into the Philadelphia afternoon. The air was cooler than it had been, the summer finally loosening its grip, a hint of autumn carried on the wind. She paused on the steps for a moment, letting the daylight touch her face, feeling the weight of the past 4 months settle differently now. Not gone, not forgotten, but transformed. The kind of experience that becomes part of one's foundation, rather than a burden still carried. Ruth appeared at her side. "Ready to go home?" Eliza looked down the street, toward the harbor, toward the south. "Yes," she said. "Take me home." The journey back to Charleston took 4 days, the same as the journey north. But she did not spend the return in the same manner. The northbound trip had been dedicated to poring over ledgers, preparing for battle. The return was for reading her father's personal journals, the ones she'd retrieved from the estate strongbox before leaving, the ones she hadn't been able to bring herself to open since the week after he died. Fear had kept her away then. Not now. He had written about her more than she'd anticipated, not consistently, but scattered observations about their conversations, something she'd said that struck him, a decision she'd made that he'd watched from afar and approved of without her knowledge. She found an entry from 1810, when she was 20. He wrote, "E. reviewed the Boston Manifest today without being asked, found the discrepancy I had been watching for 3 days, said nothing about it until she was certain, then told me plainly and waited for me to confirm. She has learned the most important thing I know, the difference between thinking you're right and being right." She held on to that entry for a long time on the second day of travel, watching the fields blur past, hearing her father's voice in those words, steady and clear, across the 2 years since she'd last heard it. She had learned it from him, all of it, the patience, the preparation, the distinction between confidence and recklessness. He had taught her at his desk, in his counting house, and in the unwavering trust he had built, which he had left to her absolutely, unconditionally, because he had known precisely who she was. She carefully folded the journal and held it on her lap for the rest of the day. Charleston welcomed her on a bright September morning, the harbor alive with the scent of salt and rope, and the sharp, clean air that follows a summer's end. Thomas met the carriage at the city's edge and rode alongside until they reached the estate gates. Ruth alighted first, proceeding ahead to open the house. Higgins arrived within the hour, bearing a stack of accumulated correspondence, presented with the relief of a man handing back the reins after 3 weeks of managing anxious callers. She began sorting through it at the desk. Her desk, now her father's desk. The same oak surface, worn smooth at the edges. Most of it was business. A brief, unadorned letter from Declan Shaw. "Heard the news from Philadelphia. Well done. We'll hold the Eastern contract another year for you." A letter from Frey confirming the Caldwell Star's second run north had been uneventful, with the Boston cargo delivered and paid. A 4-page letter from Prentice Hale, a blend of professional congratulations and 3 separate business proposals. Hale was constitutionally incapable of offering praise without simultaneously identifying opportunity. She smiled, setting it aside for a more considered response. At the bottom of the stack, a plain envelope, no return seal. She almost set it aside, but something prompted her to open it. It was from Clara. 2 paragraphs, no address, no date. Clara wrote that she was leaving Charleston, going to family in Virginia and perhaps further north. She wrote that she hoped Eliza understood. She had never intended the harm that had been done, which Eliza read not as an excuse, but as the truth. It almost certainly was. She wrote one more thing in the last line that Eliza read twice, and then set down carefully on the desk. She wrote, "You are the only woman I have ever met who reminded me that I had a choice. I am sorry I had to learn it at your expense." Eliza sat for a long time at that desk in the quiet of the September morning. She thought about choices, about the ones she had made and the ones that had been made around her, and the ones she intended to make going forward. She thought about her father's journals and his entry about the Boston Manifest, and she thought about 3 years of a gold band and a summer of fighting to reclaim what was hers. And she thought about the specific particular feeling of walking out of that Charleston hall with her chin up and her ring left behind on the table. She had not known that night exactly what she was walking toward. She had known only what she was done with. She knew now. She pulled a fresh sheet of paper from the desk drawer. She wrote to Hale accepting one of his 3 proposals, declining the other 2, and making a counter-proposal on the third that she thought was better than his version. She wrote to Captain Frey with a new route consideration for the spring season. She wrote to Mr. Higgins with 4 items of business she wanted addressed before the month was out. Then she wrote one more letter, short, to the board of the Charleston Maritime Registry, which governed the licensing of harbor operations along the lower Atlantic coast. She had been appointed 3 days before her departure for Philadelphia to an advisory position on the board. The first woman to hold any formal position in the registry's 30-year history, secured through Hale's influence and Shaw's backing, and the simple, unanswerable argument that no one with better knowledge of Atlantic shipping operations was available. She had not had time to respond to the appointment letter before leaving. She responded now. She accepted. She accepted in her own name, in her own hand, with the Caldwell seal pressed into the wax. She set the letters in order and rang for Thomas to take them. Then she sat back in her father's chair and looked out the window at the September morning. The harbor in the distance, the ships at their moorings, the whole breathing, working world of commerce and movement and human enterprise that her family had been part of for 40 years. She had not set out of that summer night in June to become any particular thing. She had set out to survive, to protect what her father had built, to keep her own name and her own ground, and her own right to decide what happened to the work of the people who had loved her. She had done all of that, and somewhere in the doing of it, something else had happened too. Something quieter, something that did not announce itself with the crash of a crystal glass or the spin of a gold ring on a polished table. She had become fully and completely, and without anyone's permission, exactly who she was always going to be. The letters went out that afternoon. The ships ran their routes. The harbor moved. Eliza Caldwell sat at her father's desk in the house her grandfather had built to last, and she opened the next file, and she went to work. She had built nothing yet. That was what the rest of her life was for.